Hey folks, welcome back to Hobbyshire. This is part 2 of Project Warzone and we are going to finish the bridge. If you haven't watched part 1, I strongly recommend that you do, because in part 1 I show you from the very beginning how to build this bridge that you can see on the screen. I take you step by step from the initial sketch to reaching this point, which is now ready to be painted, and that is what we are going to focus on in this video. The bridge is part of a bigger project, but I go over that in detail in the first video, so watch that one first, link is in the description, then come back to this one, okay? Okay, let's go. So if you folks remember where we left off in the last one, we had just mod podged it, and this is the state that it's in now. I put in so many hours of work already that I knew with painting it, I really wanted to take my time to match the quality of the build itself. Those of you who follow my channel know that I usually have a go-to technique for painting stone that results in things like this and this. But I wanted to try something a lot more in depth. It would take more layers and would require a bit of experimentation. So I knew there was a chance it could all go terribly wrong, but that's just part of the excitement of playing gods and building worlds. And that's why I also have this. It's literally just a piece of card with some of the bricks glued on, and then they're base coated in Mod Podge just like the actual bridge. It's just an easy way of having something to test colours on before putting them on the actual model. My first step is I took some neutral grey, added some black, and then a touch of blue to it. Like literally just a dip of the brush to give it a very slight tone in there. I used a wide flat makeup brush to overbrush it over all the stones, just to give a better base colour than the Mod Podge itself. I will say that in most of these acrylic paints that I'm using on this occasion, I noticed they went on a little dark and then lightened up once they had dried. So that made me a bit nervous because I wasn't actually getting the correct accurate shade on there until it dried, so there was a little bit of guesswork going on. It turned out to be a couple of shades lighter than I wanted it, but it looked perfect, so I went with it. After that first layer dried, I took a fresh mix of the neutral grey and I added the blue to it without adding any black. Then it was just a case of dry brushing all over again. It's definitely a heavy dry brush, and in a lot of areas I even just stippled it on. Oh, and if you are wondering what that little thing in the bottom corner is, that's my homemade DIY dry brush palette. You can see how I made that by checking out the video, which I will link in the description of this one. It didn't take me too long to do this step, and I wasn't trying to be even or consistent with how I spread it out. Some areas got a lot more paint than others. This was completely random and was down to me just not caring, because there's going to be a lot of layers on top of all this stuff, including washes and shades, so it's really just to get rid of the majority of the flat black Mod Podge tone with something that at least a little bit resembles the colour of stone. I let it all dry completely, and then I took a brown paint and began picking out random bricks. Again, no particular pattern other than trying not to pick two bricks that were touching each other. I did this all along the outside, all along the under arch, the inside walls, and then the actual ground walkway of the bridge. Then I did the same again using a yellow ochre colour, which is a bit like a murky curry yellow kind of colour. I'm not sure how to describe it, it's just called yellow ochre. I did it again using a watered down black wash, so overall I had a quick variety of different coloured bricks as a good base tone to work with. Next I used a pale tan colour. I dry brushed it on all of the bricks. I didn't have much paint on the brush, but I did scrub it on quite well to make sure it got every edge and texture that I could. I understand at this point that it looks a little, well, crap, but trust the process, okay? Things often look messy before they turn beautiful. Just ask the ugly duckling. Make sure you do it everywhere, because this is going to help to stop it looking flat and bland once the washes and shades go on. And can you see better now how those indentations look that I made with a tiny bicycle toy in the first video? Already they really go well and look like actual wagon wheels have worn down the stone from years of use. So wait for that to completely dry, and that is important, otherwise all the dry brushing you just did will just fade away. And then take some sandy coloured acrylic and mix in a tiny drop of white and a couple of drops of yellow ochre. And then, like me, I diluted it heavily into a really thin wash, and then I just started splashing it on generously. And I know you're thinking, no, you've just ruined the whole thing and turned it into a cream pie. But remember what I said, trust the process. This is heavily diluted, so it's not going to dry anywhere near as strong and as vivid as it looks right now, and hopefully it will give a bleached look on the stone, which indicates from all the years it's been sat in the sun. And this is how it looks when dry. I absolutely love it. And remember folks, it's your build, your hobby, your creation. As long as you love it, it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. We've still got some extra layers to throw on there, but I just think that there's a really nice shade of stone right there that you can see. My next step was to get an off-white acrylic. It's still white, kinda. It's just not as bright or vibrant. Maybe it has a hint of grey in there, I don't know. Like, it's as light of a grey as you can go before actually becoming white. I don't know, like I say, it's just called off-white. I dry brush this everywhere just to bring out the highlights. And if you're familiar with Citadel paints, this paint to me looks almost identical to pallid witch flesh. If that helps you identify it at all, because some people have said to me they don't know what an off-white is, and that's the best way I can describe it. And this is what we look like now. To me, they look like real actual stones already, and I can't help but be smiling at this point. It is now though time to add some darkness. I do this by taking my black wash. This is my homemade recipe. Video link is in the description if you want to see how I made it. I poured some into my cup and then diluted it heavily, probably 1 part wash to about 5 parts water, but I'm not exactly sure as I just winged it and didn't really pay much attention to measurements. I focus on 2 types of areas when applying this. First kind of area is anywhere that will be extra dirty and grimy compared to other parts of the bridge, and the second type of area is anywhere that I feel there would be shadows or where the sunlight wouldn't often be able to directly hit. This is going on a little strong, but once it dries, it will be a lot more subtle. I made sure to put an extra generous amount into them wagon wheel trenches because I wanted to emphasize those by making them extra dark and grimy so that they really stand out. I also used the back end of my brush to crush some of the foam to make a little mousy hidey hole, which I then put a generous amount of the wash in there too. I think the mouse hidey hole is a nice little extra detail because whenever I'm looking at a model, I always like seeing tiny details that are not really required, but are just a nice touch. What do you folks think? Do you like seeing small, unnecessary details in models? Or do you think they're, well, unnecessary? I let the wash completely dry and went over it one more time. This time I barely watered down my wash so that it would be strong, and I covered less of the area than I had done so the first time round. Once that had dried, I took my homemade camo shade, which is basically dark brown and olive green ink mixed together. It's also in my washes video. If you want to learn how to do that, you can again check out that video. But if you were going for something like a Citadel brand, this to me is as close as you can get to a Phonian camo shade. I'm using it to highlight grime, grunge, algae and mossy areas. Just adding that green tint to it really amps up that level of realism that we are going with here. I'm putting it in all sorts of places. The way I imagine it is I try to imagine a rainy day. Let's say it downpoured all day and then overnight the rain stopped, so the next morning all the water has started to dry up. Where would the last bits of water be? Which areas would be the last areas to dry up? Where would puddles form and stuff like that? That's where I focus on with the moss colours. Like these trenches for example. Puddles would likely form in there, even if only tiny ones, and the upper surface would dry well before the trenches did. So they get some green wash. This is how we look now, and that bleached sun-scorched pale stone colour that we have has just proven to be a really nice backdrop for them black washes and camo shades. It really makes them stand out in a cool way, don't you think? I mean, look at it, it's just fantastic, even if I do say so myself. And yes, I am praising myself and my hard work, but so what? That's not something we should be embarrassed about. A lot of people will tell you not to do that. They will say it's your ego. but it's not. It's your ability to acknowledge that you have dedicated yourself to working hard on something, and it's come out good. I highly encourage you all to praise yourself, big yourself up, buff that ego or whatever the haters say, because life is too short and it's not a competition. I want us all to win at life, and this just looks fucking brilliant. The final stage of the bricks for me is one more dry brush in plain white. I'm only focusing on the edges and the parts that are sticking out further than the rest, just to indicate where the light is catching the tips and corners, and it really brings out the vibrancy of the whole thing and makes it pop. Leaving the bricks behind, I'm moving on to the plastered walls. I'm using a beachy sand colour. It's actually called salted caramel, but it's lighter than most caramel colours in my opinion, and it looks more like a golden beach in tropical places. I base coat this colour all over all of the plastered area where I put that green stuff weld texture paste in the first video. Don't forget the little archer balconies too if you put any in there, and don't worry about getting it on any of the wood because we will deal with that later. Just focus on getting a clean, even coat on all of the plaster. I let it dry and then I go over it again, but I add some white to the paint to lighten it up just a touch, and when I paint it on I avoid the edges so that, as you can see in the video, it allows the edges to look a little bit darker than the inner parts. Again, I let it dry and then I add even more white to the paint and go over it again, covering even less of it than last time. So now we have 3 different tones in there, starting darker at the edges and getting lighter as you go towards the middle. I go over it one final time, but I just use pure white this time. I dip my brush into it and then wipe most of it off, so I can just barely stipple just little specks of it in the middle of the walls. Be very careful with this, as too much white will ruin it so fast. There is more that I want to do to the walls, but first I need the wood finished so that I can merge it all together in places where the wood and plaster meets, like on the tall booth for example. Those of you who have followed me for a while now know that wood is kinda like my kryptonite. When it comes to other things like stone for example, I have a few go-to methods that I can fall back on, which I know will result in top quality stones that will make me happy. But I don't have that with wood. I don't think I have ever painted wood the same way twice, because I just cannot find a way to paint it that I'm actually happy with. I'm still searching for that special way, a way that leaves me feeling like the wood has gone perfect. And this project is no different. I decide to try something new. I take my palette and I put a whole bunch of different colours on there. I put browns, greens, creams, caramels, whites, blacks, and I just start dipping my brush in them and going crazy. It looks like I'm putting a lot of paint on the wood, but I'm not. I'm just putting a lot of water on there so that it spreads and blends and mixes together really well on the actual wood rather than in the palette. Then I just start meshing the colours together. And you can see from the video that it's far from any form of professional work. My main goal is to try and make each plank of wood look a different weathered tone. You can see that by the time I got around to the tall booth, I had kind of given up on that idea and was mainly base coating all the planks in the dark brown whilst using the other colours to lighten or darken the areas of wood where I felt there would be shading or extra weathering. When it had all dried, I started back at the beginning and gave every plank a heavy dry brush in white to bring out all the definition and roughness of the planks that we had scratched in earlier with the utility knife and wire brush. Then I went over it all again in a black wash, being quite generous in the amount I put on to let it get all up in the crooks and crannies. Finally, after letting the wash completely dry, I gave it another dry brush in white. I wasn't going to do this part, but I felt that if the years of sunshine and stuff had been enough to bleach the stones into the pale style that we had given them, then it would also have dried out the wood a lot, and I felt that a white dry brush would make that dried effect look a bit more realistic. Again, like I said, I'm not that good at painting wood, but it turned out good enough for my own taste, and that's all that matters. Moving on to the roof tiles, or shingles, or whatever you want to call them, I had a teal paint colour and decided to use that. I know I should have probably have gone with a dark grey or even a terracotta kind of colour if I wanted realism, but I felt like the teal would make it pop with that fantasy style kind of thing, so I went with that. Before I applied the base coat, I did add a little black to the teal though, just to darken it. Then I painted it all over, trying to cover everything, but not bothered if I missed any spots, because that would just let the black peek through and insinuate a bit of shadow and depth. I let it dry, and remember earlier I said some of the paints go on darker and then lighten? This one did the opposite. It went on lighter and then darkened as it dried, but that was fine. I went over it all again, this time using the normal teal colour without adding any black to it. I would say it's a heavy overbrush, covering most of that base coat but still leaving maybe around 20% of it still visible. This is to build up layers and really bring out that weathered depth. Next, I added a tiny bit of white to the teal and just stippled it all over randomly to give the tiles a bit of a patchy look. Finally, I added even more white to the teal, and then I used it to add some highlights by brushing against the edges of each tile. I think it came out quite nicely, to be honest. Next, it was time to finish the plaster on the walls. Even though we had layered different shades on there, it still looked a little too clean for my liking. Because remember, this bridge is battered, beaten, ancient, and for the most part abandoned. So I took my palette and I filled one of the bowls with a watered down black wash, and then another of my bowls with plain water. For the first step, I dipped the brush into the black wash and then I paint around the edge of the plaster. Then I dip the brush into the plain water and use it to kind of blend the black wash into nothing to help the transition be a little bit smoother. I let that dry completely, and then I get back to it and go over it again with a black wash and just add another layer into the corners and darkest recesses. I also do it on some of the wood in some parts to add some contrast there too. I then work on the bolts, giving them all a coat of lead belcher by Citadel. I use a small brush so that I can be careful not to splash too much of it onto the wood. I also use the same paint to cover these end areas of the pillar caps. Originally I was going to make them wood, but to be honest I forgot all about them until this point. I couldn't be bothered to go back to trying to paint decent looking wood again, so they became metal instead. I also decided that I wanted all these strips on top of the roofs to be metal, so they got a base coat in lead belcher too. Then I used a technical effect paint from Citadel called Typhus Corrosion. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, I don't know. It's not my usual way of adding a rust effect, but I had never tried it before and I wanted to give it a shot. So I painted over all the lead belcher in this, letting it pull thicker in some areas and thinner in others. With the finish line in sight, this is what we have so far, and to be honest, you could leave it there. I think it looks fantastic. It looks absolutely brilliant. I was already really proud of it. But if you know me, you know I love adding moss to everything. One reason is because it assists in the aged old look. Another reason is I just think the green of the moss really makes everything pop so brilliantly. But mostly it's also to cover up any mistakes or ugly parts that I've done. I take an empty tub, I add a load of normal PVA glue, and then I just get some leftover flock. It's mixed colours because that's what I have, but it doesn't have to be. You can just use one shade if you like and it will still look cool. It's also a mixture of fine and coarse flock too, but again, that's just purely optional. I pour the flock into the PVA glue and mix it all together. If you are going to mix and apply it with a brush like I often do, make sure you use a brush that's already ruined, because this will ruin it for sure. If you find that when you mix it, it's too thick and clumpy, you can always add more PVA. I like it to be quite runny so that it spreads easier, but not so runny that it will trickle down every time I try and put it on something. Once you are happy with the consistency, just start slapping it on. Think about where you would see moss growing and put it there. I will say though, some folks tend to overthink this. My advice is just don't worry about it. Just pick a spot, slap some on, and then move on to the next spot. It doesn't have to be completely realistic, and if you add too much, well then it just looks even older than it was, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just have fun with it and put it on as much or as little as you like, because hey, guess what? It's your project. You're the boss. If somebody doesn't like it, well, they are completely free to fuck off and go make their own. This is how mine looked when I was finished, and I'm just in love with this thing. For some finishing touches, I grabbed some of these. These are just grass tufts and shrubbery and plants and stuff like that. I always like to keep a collection of this stuff so that I have a variety to choose from. They are self-adhesive, but I don't trust that, so I also dip them into some super glue before sticking them on in random places. And that's it, folks. Let's now have a cool little montage. So, what do you think? I love it, and this has easily become one of the best things I have ever made in terms of crafting. There is still a little more that I might add to it in the future, but not until I have it placed on the skirmish board, and that's quite a long way from now, I think. In any case, this is part 2 of Project Warzone completed, and after giving it some thought, I have decided to call this board Riverpass, because it was suggested to me by a family friend, and since it's the only suggestion I got, and I quite like it, that's what I'm going with. So from now on, this will be known as Project Riverpass. I'm not sure what part of the project I will work on next, but I'll be sure to let you know as soon as I do. For now, folks, I'm going to go chill and watch the finale of Rings of Power. Toodaloo!